Singing and music teachers, acting coaches, and dance teachers. When your students ghost at the last minute, do they expect a free makeup? If they pay late and make you send multiple reminders? If they take an extended break from lessons but then expect to somehow get their exact time again many months later, it causes massive disruption to your business and your bottom line, right? So stay tuned because I'm going to help you solve these problems with one simple piece of paper. Hi, I'm Fiona Flyte, and it is my passion and my privilege to help performing artists with both money and personal power. Because as far as I'm concerned, you have been gifted with extraordinary powers of personal expression, wisdom to share, whether you are a performing artist full-time or you teach or you do both. I believe you deserve to be a profitable performer. So definitely subscribe to the channel, follow me on Instagram, join my free Facebook group, and all the rest. Now let's dive in and get one thing straight. If you teach singing, if you teach music, if you teach acting, if you teach dance, if you're any kind of teacher, and honestly, if you're any kind of performer at all, if you're a gigging performer, etc., you actually own a business. Yes, a business. And with a business, you need to have what? A contract. So in today's video, we're going to talk about exactly what needs to go into your music lesson contracts or any kind of artist coaching contracts when you're teaching, when you've got students. And then if you haven't already seen it, after you watch this, go back and watch this video all about how to enforce your contract, because it's really a two-part process. There's the having of the contract, and that's what we're going to talk about today, exactly what needs to go into the contract. But there's also the part where you need to have enough personal power, conviction, and confidence to enforce whatever is in your contract, because it really makes no sense at all to have a contract if you don't enforce it. And then next week, we're actually going to cover contracts for those of you who are doing a lot of gigs. But today, it's all about lessons, music lessons, acting coaching, anything like that, what needs to go in your contract. And you can take notes on today's video to make sure you remember everything that needs to go into your contract, but you can also download the checklist I made for you. It's in the description below. Okay, let's dive in with 5 of the most important things you're going to need to include in your lesson contract, which can also be called your studio policies. And definitely stay to the end because I've got a bonus tip that I learned from being a parent myself. Number 1, I highly recommend that you include a line for signature and date. Now this may seem obvious, but a lot of people now have got their studio contracts or lesson policies up on websites where you need to check the T&C, the terms and conditions. And I highly encourage you to do that. So if you take lesson payments online, then have your studio policies, your contract as the T&C that they need to check when they make their purchase, just like any other online purchase. However, how many times have you said yes, check, to accepting the policies for Facebook or your iPhone, and you didn't read all those pages? How many times? So you can kind of assume that there's a good chance that a number of your students or your students' parents have not actually read them. So legally, they checked the box, so that's good, but we don't want to actually get into any legal conflict with the students or with their parents. And so what I also encourage you to do is have a printed sheet of your lesson contract or your studio policies that you have your students. And if you teach kids, I highly recommend that you have the parents, yes, sign this because they're responsible for the money, right? But also I would have the kids sign it, because a lot of the time, and as a parent, I can tell you this, the kids will get their parents to do what they're supposed to do, right? Sometimes the kid's like, hey mom, remember there's a late fee if we're late, like we need to be there on time. You might get the kids to help you out a little bit, and vice versa. The parent might say, you know, if you really want to keep these lessons going, it's not okay for me to pay for last minute cancellations just because you don't feel like going to the lesson. And then the kid's like, oh yeah, I forgot, you're right, I need to be better about this. So I highly recommend that you have that signature line on your contract and that you actually go through the contract with the student And if it's a child situation, with the child and the parent at your first lesson. Now, it's not a problem if you're introducing studio policies now and you already have lots of students who've been with you for some time. Don't worry about it. What you can do is say, I've recently revised my studio policies and it's in my policies that we review it once together. So let's do that today. So you just save a little bit of time before or at the end of a lesson. So we were just talking about having a signature line for your student or the parents or the parent and student, right? But what about the expectation of you as the teacher? It can actually be a nice thing to sign it together. So they sign their line and then you sign your line like an actual contract. And so this next section that I'd love for you to include is expectations. And rather than putting all of the expectations on the student, like how much are you going to practice? Like, I expect you to practice. I expect you to be on time. I expect you, the parent, to make sure your child is well rested and has eaten, had some water, whatever your expectations are. I expect you to bring the correct sheet music, anything. What's the expectation that they can have of you? And this then creates a more even playing field and a whole lot of respect. For example, maybe they can expect you to provide karaoke tracks, or maybe they can expect you to show up with a positive attitude, or maybe they can expect you to honor your makeup policy. Whatever is really your value system, like, let's put that in the expectations. So again, everybody is on the same page. And of course, in this section on expectations is that the student or the parent is responsible for paying and honoring your cancellation policy. Which brings us, of course, to the cancellation policy. And this perhaps is the most important section. We want to make sure that you and your student are on exactly the same page regarding cancellations and that there's no miscommunication whatsoever. So, for example, how much notice do you need for a cancellation? Do you offer cancellations or makeups at all? Do they just have to pay no matter what? I definitely have seen some contracts online that are very clear. I've got a full studio and you pay by the month and you either take your lesson or you don't. But in order to hold your lesson spot, you pay for the lesson. So that works for more experienced teachers with full studios and waiting lists. But what about you? Is that your situation? Or are you more flexible? Now, for me in my own business, when I was teaching singing, I had a more lenient cancellation policy because I needed a lenient cancellation policy for myself. My expectation was that the performers I was working with, both singers and actors, were professionals. And that means that in Los Angeles, sometimes they do in fact have same-day auditions. Well, you know who else has a same-day audition from time to time? Me. And so I needed my students to respect the fact that sometimes I had to cancel same day for an important audition for my agent, but I gave them the same respect. Another place that you want to be very clear has to do with sickness. Now again, I have a relatively flexible policy when it comes to illness. I don't really want my students and now my business clients to have to show up if they're super sick and they're just not fully present. And I definitely didn't want my singing students to be singing on sore throats, for example. But that doesn't mean that you have to be flexible. So in some cases, teachers will say you've got a 48-hour window to cancel, but if you cancel within the 48 hours, then it doesn't matter whether it's illness or a broken bicycle or a flat tire, you're still responsible for paying for the lesson. Now, other people are like, you got in a car crash, you don't have to pay for the lesson and we'll do a makeup. Or you got in a car crash, no problem, you don't have to pay for the lesson, I'll see you next week. Or you got a flat tire, no problem, we'll do a makeup on Friday. This is up to you. The most important part, though, is the clarity that there is between you and your student in terms of communication, that everybody is on the same page. There's really no wrong answer. There's no wrong policy so long as it's what you require. But for example, I wouldn't set the policy of you pay regardless of whether or not you're sick, but I don't want sick people in my studio, so you have to cancel. Like, that wouldn't be fair, would it? Another thing, depending upon where you live, can have to do with inclement weather. Like, is it a snow day? Is it a rain day? And I saw some people have got policies saying if it's a snow day or a rain day, and normally we meet in person, that day we'll meet on Zoom. No problem. But what is it for you? Do you want to do any lessons on Zoom? Do you want to do any lessons online? Does that work for you or not? It's up to you. Now, a subset of the cancellation policy is really your makeup policy. So makeups and cancellations are not exactly the same thing, because sometimes you can have a cancellation policy that includes no makeups. But in other ones, it's like if you cancel 24 hours ahead of time, then we can do a makeup. Again, this is up to you. Just make sure you do include it. Okay, so now let's say you do have a pretty full studio with a waiting list and there are prime lesson spots. What does the student have to do to maintain their lesson spot? And this has to do with scheduling, right? So the fourth thing that needs to be included is scheduling. In order to keep their prime lesson spot, do they need to always be on time? Do they need to be all paid up? Can they not cancel? Or are you more flexible? How do you like to schedule? Do you have an online scheduling app like Calendly or Acuity? Or do you only like to do it face-to-face in lessons? Can people text you? Can your students text or call you about the schedule? Or you're like, no, I don't want those texts or calls. Let's do it all online. This needs to be clearly laid out again in your studio policies. Okay, last but not least, although don't forget about the bonus tip, but for right now, tip number 5 has to do with pricing, packages, and payment structure. How do you take your payments? Do you do Venmo? Do you do PayPal? Do you do check? Do you do cash? Do you have a credit card? Is it all online through your online payment processor? Although I will definitely give you the tip to make it easy for your student and encourage you to take payments in as many ways as humanly possible. But the other thing here is to be really clear about exactly how much it costs to do lessons. Now, I would encourage you to have a subscription model where they can pay for more, they commit to more time, more lessons, and there's maybe a discount built in. So for example, instead of just $50 for a lesson, let's say, and you pay as you go, or let's make it $65 to make it easier on my math. Let's say it's $65 for one lesson and they pay as they go, or they can pay monthly and now it's $60 a lesson. So for the month, it would be $240 instead of whatever 65. I thought I was gonna make it easier, but I didn't. Or you only do monthly, so it's $200 for the month, let's say, and it's $50 a lesson. But if they pay, let's say they commit for 6 months, so that would be $1,200. And let's say you get 6 months for $1,000, so you would save $200. It's a win-win for anyone who can pay in advance because you're guaranteed that the money is there and they get the break on the lesson cost, which for me, as both someone who buys coaching and also who pays for lessons for my children, I just like saving that little money. It just kind of makes me feel good. So that can be a really fun way to incentivize your students to make longer term commitments. And so this is also the case for me as a business coach. For example, I might have a program that costs $777 for the program, but if they buy my pass Unshakable, then they get all the programs at a much lower cost per month than if they were buying each program separately. And then another thing you might want to include on your studio policies is whether you have a sliding scale. Maybe there are people in your community that have lower income you really want to serve, and you do have a need-based sliding scale, for example. Or maybe you offer scholarships and there's an application process. All of that can be included as well. And then you definitely want to make it clear when you expect to get paid. Is it before the lesson? Is it only the subscription model? What happens if they're paying lesson by lesson, but one day they come and they forgot? What's your policy then? Do you say, actually, you need to go run to the ATM and come back with money? Or are you like, okay, we can let it slide this time? Now, you might want to have it written into your contract that there's no sliding, but if it's somebody who has been a regular student for many years and they forget one day, I personally don't have a problem with it. But again, this is not about me. This is about you. There's no wrong answer, and it's exactly what feels best to you. All right. Okay. So now one more thing to consider, and this is a bonus tip that I learned after having signed so many contracts for my children's extracurricular activities. And this has to do with liability. So there are things that can go wrong, even in a music lesson. In a singing lesson, somebody could develop, vocal problems. They could develop nodes. If you're playing, a stringed instrument, you get calluses, you could get bleeding fingers, bleeding blisters. There could be a trip and fall situation. There's a lot of things that could happen. Now, in my experience, none of these things did happen. And so I was lucky and I never had this clause or any of that kind of level of legality in my contracts, but it is something to really consider. Now, I am not a lawyer and I have no liability here because this is not legal advice. But if you wanted to get to this level of certainty that you couldn't be sued for any reason whatsoever, then you might consider having a lawyer draw up your contract for you. And I'm going to drop a link in the description for a lawyer who actually does create these kinds of contracts for people to buy online. Now, most of them are for online coaches, but they may be applicable for you as somebody who does artist coaching as well, including music lessons. Okay, one more thing that's just really, really important, and that is that you do also need to do your own inner identity work, because it doesn't matter how wonderful your contract is, if you don't have the confidence to enforce it, it won't help you. And that requires inner work. It requires stepping more into your personal power. It's understanding that in any relationship, having some degree of boundary really is a good thing. And that within the boundary, within the structure, our relationships can be even more healthy and caring and kind. Now, if you want help with mindset, with personal power, with the energetic part of all of this, I definitely recommend hopping into any of my programs that appeals to you. So my programs typically focus on specific strategies to help you in your business, like social media or marketing or sales, yes. But in all of my programs, we also are dealing with the personal power that's required to actually do the strategies. So pretty much you're going to get some energetic and mindset work no matter which program you hop into. But if you have questions, just message me or DM me on Facebook or Instagram. Speaking of which, you definitely want to follow me there and join my free Facebook group, which I did in fact make, especially for performing artists. And also subscribe to the channel so you can get more valuable trainings just like this one. And now, as always, go out into the world and shine your light. You have a voice, you deserve to be heard, and the world deserves to hear you.